Was in this meeting years ago, one of those day-long retreat type meetings, and we were starting off with an icebreaker. What we were asked is your strongest virtue, and there was a list of virtues we could choose from. On the list were honesty, courage, compassion, loyalty, and humility. Do you see that this was a trap? Can you imagine? I'm really super humble, probably the most humble person here. No one chose humility as their utmost virtue, which may be a sign that we were all really quite humble. It's very confusing. Which did make me think twice when I learned that the group of UU congregations with whom we share monthly theme resources, we're going to be focusing on humility this month. Still, I think humility is a deeply important religious virtue. It's certainly an ancient one, and it has tendrils into Unitarian Universalist theology. And importantly to today's theme, humility may just help us to do better when it comes to welcoming people of all social classes in our congregations. If you've been a member of this congregation for a while, or if you've just been around for a while, you've been subjected to my work on social class and American religion before, so I'll tread carefully here. I'm sure to retell a story. I apologize. But it's important to note the well-documented fact that in American religion, across faiths, across denominations, we group ourselves according to social class maybe more clearly than in any other place. Our faith homes are voluntary associations. We're part of them because we choose to be. And when we have the choice, we tend to group ourselves with people whom we perceive to be like us. Usually that has something to do with the traditional markers of social class, with income, with wealth, education, job prestige, which is an old sociological measure of how much power and prestige a job lends a person in culture. Generally speaking, the more we have of those things, money, income, education, the more power and mobility we have in society. And our very human tendency is to group ourselves with people who have comparable amounts of access to societal power. Comparable wealth, comparable work, comparable education, or at least our perception that that exists. It's really hard to talk about social class in the United States. I did my doctoral dissertation on the subject, and I still find it difficult to talk about. And I always get pushback when I talk about it in public, in large part, I think, because people don't want to believe that there's such a thing, that in our country in 2018, it matters where a person goes to school or how much money they make, but it does matter. It doesn't mean we can make judgment calls on a person's character based on their social class position, but it does make a difference, our social class, in the way we experience the world and in the way we experience one another. You may know that I used to be an evangelical Christian minister. In those Nazarene congregations I served, I was serving mainly farmers and factory workers. There was an occasional management person, but we were all suspicious of people who wore dress clothes to work. I, being the son of two factory workers myself, had all kinds of ideas about who the overeducated upper middle class elite were. But after my theology changed and I could no longer be a Nazarene with integrity, I found Unitarian Universalism a good fit for me theologically. But when I moved from the Nazarenes to the UUs, the change in social class was really clear to me. I came in for my part, with all my presuppositions and was suspicious of everyone I met with a PhD or a fancy car. It did not help me get to know people. And people were suspicious of me too. The first UU congregation I served back in Indiana almost didn't call me because they were worried I might be on a secret soul-saving mission from the Church of the Nazarene. Can you imagine how terribly that would go in our congregations? One of my colleagues, after a minister's meeting, said, "Wow, you drive a pickup?" He said, "I've never had a colleague who drives a truck." We occupy certain social spaces. We have access to a particular blend of social class markers. We group ourselves, as a rule, there are plenty of exceptions, but as a rule, with people whose markers are similar to ours. And crossing those boundaries can be jarring. People of goodwill across the social class spectrum find themselves suddenly conscious of their social standing when they cross borders. Personally, making that crossing instilled in me a passion to learn more about religion and social class. But upon hearing about my interest in social class early in my UU ministry career, one older colleague said something like, "I don't know why we can't just accept that we're an upper middle class denomination and get on with it." Though it shook me for a while and it didn't make him my favorite colleague, that's actually a pretty good question. Why should we care? If the social class divide is so stubborn, and it is, and if we aren't likely to drastically change the makeup of our congregations when it comes to social class, and we are not, then why bother? Well, you won't be surprised that I have an answer for that. Although our denomination may be made up largely of upper middle class people, we are also working class people and poor people and people from working class and poor backgrounds. And we would do well to think not about how to attract more working class folks necessarily, though that would be wonderful, but how to better be congregations in which people of various social classes can work together and laugh together and learn together, be a congregation together with authenticity. Here, I think, is where humility can help. But a particular kind of humility. There is no doubt that humility as a religious virtue has a shadow side. Women were long encouraged to bear up under the burden of abusive husbands by imitating Christ's humility in the face of violence, for example. The encouragement to humility can be used to keep people in their place, to prevent them from rising. But I think that's more like humiliation than humility. It's certainly not the kind of humility I'm talking about. I prefer instead George Mason University professor June Price Tangney's description of humility. It has 4 major qualities. The first, she says, is an accurate assessment of oneself, including both strengths and weaknesses, neither unduly favorable or unduly unfavorable. So this kind of humility isn't about false humility. I'm a big football fan, with apologies to those of you who are not. I can't count how many times I've watched elite athletes pull off these amazing catches for a touchdown. They fly through the air and grab the football and tuck it in. It's the result of years and years of training and careful attention to their bodies. And then they say in the post-game interview that they thank Jesus for the win. Come on, man. An accurate assessment of oneself takes credit for greatness when greatness is real, but doesn't ignore weaknesses either. So, Tangney's second of 4 characteristics of humility is an openness to new information, including ideas that contradict former opinions. We pride ourselves on this, we religious liberals. We are the science people, after all. Those who proclaim as part of our faith a free search for truth and meaning. This one is right in our wheelhouse. The Reverend Barbara Wells Ten Hove says she learned about humility from her father. She wrote, "To be humble, he told me, was to remain teachable. Whenever we think we know it all, real humility reminds us to stay open and willing to learn." And she continues, and I love this, "The magic words, 'I don't know,' are at the essence of both awe and humility. They're also at the heart of our faith." And Barbara Wells Ten Hove says, you might ask, how? Well, when we approach the universe with awe, while our first response can and likely will be, wow. Have you seen the desert night sky at 1 or 2 a.m. out in the superstitions? Wow. But she says perhaps our second response should be, I don't know. I like that. What a wonderful way to keep ourselves open to new information. It's okay to not know. And there's so much we have yet to learn. Wow, I don't know, and openness to new information. Third, Tangney says, this third aspect of humility, an ability to keep one's own place in the world in perspective. Those of us who are social class climbers or movers like to take lots of credit for our own success. But I've come to see over the years that so much of my own success has to do with things and people who are really out of my control. I have worked hard. I have done good work. I've also been lucky. I think that's true to one degree or another for all of us in just about every situation. Humility helps us remember that we're not the only actors on the stages of our lives. And that leads to Dr. Tangney's fourth characteristic of humility, an ability to forget oneself, to move out of the middle of the frame. This one, I think, is the work of a lifetime. There's a certain developmental age in children when, if they hear about a natural disaster or some tragedy in a place far away, their first question is, could that happen here? Could that happen to me? It's evolutionary, it's self-protective. We're more subtle about that as we get older. So instead of asking, could this happen here? Could this happen to me? We might say, there, but by the grace of God go I. Or we might tell a story about ourselves when reminded of one by someone else's story. But we still struggle as adults not to put ourselves in the middle of every story. It's hard work. It's a key to humility to work against that tendency, to cultivate the ability to let something be about someone else. Not always, but now and then. So an accurate assessment of self, openness to new information, keeping our place in the world in perspective, and moving out of the center of some frames in our lives. This kind of humility, I think, is at the core of Unitarian Universalist faith. In fact, the Unitarian Ralph Waldo Emerson said, religion is to do right. It is to love, it is to serve, it is to think, it is to be humble. But how, we might ask, do we achieve humility? Catherine Britton wrote about Benjamin Franklin's muddled effort at humility, which echoes my experience in that meeting a while back. She wrote, Benjamin Franklin worked for years on humility, especially in his conversational habits. For example, he denied himself the pleasure of contradicting other people. That sounds terrible, doesn't it? It sounds impossible in our current situation. Denied himself the pleasure of contradicting other people, and he avoided words that implied fixed opinions. These habits became easier with long practice, but he did admit that it was easier to achieve the appearance of humility than the fact. He said, pride is so hard to overcome that even if I could conceive that I had completely overcome it, I should probably be proud of my humility. So maybe the first thing to do is to be realistic about our imperfection. We all have egos. We're all prideful to one degree or another. We're probably not going to be the most humble person ever. But I do know one thing that helps with humility. I think it's the best way to cultivate humility, to intentionally practice gratitude. Thank those people who have paved the way for us. Ask for forgiveness when we need to, and ask as soon as we realize it's necessary. Keep a gratitude journal if that could be a helpful tool for you. Gratitude helps cultivate humility. Another important practice is to keep our mortality in mind, maybe at front of mind. There's an adult education series that's put out by the Unitarian Universalist Association. In one session on humility, the late Reverend Forrest Church notes that the words human, humane, humanitarian, humor, humility, and humble are all related. These words connect humility to our humanity and to the earth on which we dwell. He writes, from dust to dust we live and move and have our being. Our kinship is a mortal kinship. The mortar of mortality binds us fast to one another. Every person we meet is a fellow traveler on this brief human journey. Each of them has something to teach us, May we be humble enough to get past our perceived differences and learn the lessons our fellow travelers hold for us. If we're humble, if we make room for new information, then it might be possible to learn from one another, to genuinely learn from one another, to stop demonizing people who have money in the bank and people who don't, people who have PhDs and people who are self-educated, people who drive pickups and Priuses, who drive Toyotas and Teslas, all being a congregation together without demonizing one another, learning from each other. To make our congregations a more welcoming place for all the people who cross our thresholds, no matter what social class they're part of. I think we're called to that work even if we never achieve it completely. And isn't that, again, what our principles call us to do? To draw our circles of love and inclusion wider and wider and wider. Every wider circle takes intention. I conclude with a poem from that UUA curriculum on humility. We must sit down and reason together. Perhaps we should sit in the dark. In the dark, we could utter our feelings. In the dark, we could propose and describe and suggest. In the dark, we could not see who speaks, and only the words would say what they say. No one would speak more than twice. No one would speak less than once. Thus, saying what we feel and what we want, what we fear for ourselves and each other into the dark, perhaps we could begin to listen. The women must learn to dare to speak. The men must bother to listen. The women must learn to say, I think this is so. The men must learn to stop dancing solos on the ceiling. After each speaks, she or he will repeat a ritual phrase. It is not I who speaks, but the wind. Wind blows through me. Long after me is the wind. Amen.